Hello, everybody. Happy Friday, and welcome to another edition of Sports Speak, episode 85. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Back here, me and Tim, first time in about a month that both of us have been on the show at the same time. Tim missed a week, then I was in Nebraska last week for men's basketball, and Tim and Raheel held down the fort to talk about that crazy divisional playoff weekend. And let me just say, I know it's a couple weeks out, but this is my first time on the show since then. That had to be the greatest weekend of football I have ever seen. I mean, 4 action-packed games, and they kept getting better and better as it went down. But we have a lot to talk about today. Of course, the Super Bowl matchup is set. We'll recap the conference championship games. The NBA, some news, baseball, and NASCAR kicks off their season at the LA Coliseum. And we're going to be doing some picks for that. I'll explain how that's going to work this season as well towards the end of the show. Also, a shout out. Hopefully it works, but I'm going to be trying to upload this to Anchor, so it'll be available. The show, along with YouTube, will be available on various podcast sites as well to hope to increase some viewership here of Sports Speak. But let's jump right into it, Tim. And we haven't done this in quite a while. I want to do an SEC recap to start things off, and I'll start with mine. And for people new, we do a surprise from the week, something that we saw that was expected, and then a conclusion. I'll start with my surprise, and I'm going to start in the NBA. I was just talking to Tim about this. The Portland Trailblazers, who Damian Lillard entrusted his faith in and trusted ownership that they were going to be all in. Well, they've traded away now Norman Powell and Robert Covington to the Clippers and got back Eric Bledsoe on an expiring contract and a couple other subpar players. Also gave up a draft pick. But this is not the first bad move by them. What's surprising, though, is Norman Powell was under team contract for the next 4 seasons, and he's been having a really good year, one of his best of his career. And for the Blazers to trade him away, really surprising for a team that still feels that they're in it, because at this point in the NBA, anybody can still be in it with this play-in tournament with 10 teams making the playoffs. You never know. It's a very topsy-turvy year in the NBA. So I'm very surprised, and I'm also still surprised that Damian Lillard continues to stick with this organization. I'm not one that really condones players and superstars thinking they're too good for a city and trying to request out. But at the same time, if anybody was going to do that, I'm shocked that Damian Lillard hasn't tried to get out of Portland, because to me, the front office has done nothing in his 8-year career to really set him up, aside from drafting CJ McCollum. And Portland continues to be stuck behind several different Western Conference teams. And even the teams in the smaller markets like Portland, such as the Suns, the Jazz, the Nuggets, they've all made strides to get better over the last couple of years, and they've gone from being mid-tier Western Conference teams to contending, and for the Suns, making it all the way to the NBA Finals. Portland continues to just tread water, and I'm surprised that Damian Lillard hasn't tried to get out of there. My expectation, Tom Brady did end up retiring on Tuesday. Tim and Raheel last week ended up being a little ahead of the fact talking about it, but a lot of that's due to Adam Schefter. Once Schefter reported it, I expected it was going to happen eventually, but I think this has to be a lesson for journalists out there. Tom Brady is the greatest player in NFL history. With someone with those accolades, with 7 Super Bowls, with the MVPs, the 22 seasons, leading the league in passing yards in his final year, he should be granted the opportunity for it to be himself that says when he's calling it quits. Adam Schefter knew what was going to happen. Obviously, he had heard word, as had Jeff Darlington at ESPN. But Tom Brady was deliberately not saying anything as to not upstage the conference championship games. And during the dead week after the conference championship games leading up to the Pro Bowl, that's when he was planning to announce his retirement. We knew it was coming. You could tell from his words all the way back the last couple of weeks of the regular season about how he wants to spend time with family. Tom Brady, his position, his stature, he should be granted the chance himself to be the one to say when he's going to call it quits. So in the future, I think for journalists who want to report a big story, think about who it's going to impact and think about maybe letting them have the chance to say it themselves, because Tom Brady clearly can't be too happy with Adam Schefter kind of sharing his news before he was necessarily ready to share it himself. But not, once again, I expected this to happen at this point, really expected it from the first news where he was saying that he wanted to spend more time with family, because you never hear that from Tom Brady. You could tell retirement was imminent. And in conclusion, the Super Bowl is going to be fun. The Bengals are big-time underdogs. The Rams, of course, we'll dive more into it next week when we do our Super Bowl preview on Super Bowl weekend. But Nonetheless, I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be flashy. Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, two great receivers on full display. Bengals are going to struggle with that O-line. We know the defense for the Rams is much better than the Bengals O-line, but we saw Joe Burrow be able to escape over and over again against the Chiefs. And we'll get to both of those conference championship games in just a few minutes. But I think it's a fun matchup. Two very likable teams. Matthew Stafford, very likable, finally getting a chance to play in the Super Bowl. I know Zoe's pretty pumped about that. And the Cincinnati Bengals, who nobody thought was making it. We all kind of agreed on this, our preseason show, that they were going to finish last in the AFC North because the Browns, the Steelers, the Ravens all seemed like they had too much. But even with the injuries in the North that kind of paved the way for the Bengals, that didn't just matter. The Bengals just proved to be the superior team in the AFC, outplayed Kansas City at Arrowhead Stadium in the AFC Championship. And I know they're underdogs, but they were underdogs against Kansas City. They were underdogs against Tennessee. You never know. And Joe Burrow has never lost a championship game before, and he did it 2 years ago with LSU. And look at how LSU changed as a program for that 1 year. And now that Joe Burrow's gone, they go back to a 6-win team. Joe Burrow just makes whoever he's with better. So in conclusion, Bengals-Rams is going to be an awesome matchup. But Tim, I want to let you get in here with your SEC.
Well, is it okay if I do it backwards? Because I'm going to have the same exact C as you in that regards.
Yeah, okay.
Because I'm going to say, I'm going to put it like this. You know, as talking about it last week with Raheel and so on throughout the playoffs, even the preseason review, listen, the fact that the Cincinnati Bengals have gone from a subpar, arguably the last 2 years, one of the worst teams in the NFL, to competing for a Super Bowl this year is absolutely remarkable. And you mentioned Joe Burrow. Last week I said, I think it's done. And I know every week to this point I've said, the Bengals, I just don't know. But I'm bought in right now. I will say this. Joe Burrow has proven why he's an elite quarterback, why he's the future. And the fact that he's been able to make such big time throws, big time plays. And the one thing too, and I'll compare it to the New York Giants, let's say back in their Super Bowl runs, right? It's not about the score. It's not about, how you play exactly. It's about how you stand up in big moments, how you answer in big moments. And we cannot say to this point, Joe Burrow has not had ice in his veins, as they say, in some of the biggest moments this season to turn around and bring the Bengals home the victory. So with that being said, the Super Bowl is going to be exciting. But I think the big thing that people have to be real excited for, honestly, not the fact that Joe Burrow, the Bengals, carried a team with zero expectations to the Super Bowl. It's the fact that you're looking on the opposite side, a quarterback, Matthew Stafford, that's been underrated his entire career. Everyone said, he's going to LA. I still don't know if he has the answers. He's turned around an offense with Odell Beckham Jr., Cooper Kupp. Sure, they had Robert Woods before the injury. But the point is, with the receiving staff and what they had, that hadn't really changed for 3-4 years, made a Super Bowl with Jared Goff, and a franchise that, might I add, this really could be their last chance at the Super Bowl. And I know that sounds insane because they traded for Matthew Stafford, but let's not forget 2-3 years ago, all the cap this team endured just to give themselves a chance back to relevancy after firing Coach Fisher. So the fact of the matter is, for the Rams, you want to see this. Listen, rather you like or hate Odell, you cannot say that he was right in this scenario. You cannot say that in regards to the Rams, this team hasn't progressively gotten better as the season's gone on. And we also can't say that they were not the strongest team in the NFC West. Because yes, while the defense of the 49ers, absolutely remarkable, we proved the Cardinals were consistently inconsistent after the DeAndre Hopkins injury, and Kyler Murray did not step up. The Rams were the team that stepped up in big moments, and ultimately to knock off Tom Brady in a playoff, especially when he's defending Super Bowl champion, not easy. And of course, I know they almost Atlanta Falcons, but at the end of the day, last week we talked about with Real, it was going to be the big defense versus the big offense. Who's going to make the bigger play, on the AFC side? Who's going to have the possession last? The Rams, of course, the Bengals forced a turnover, had the last possession. They move on, and defense came to play to an extent in the NFC Championship game. I'm eager to see it because I think it's going to be a real balanced game. But when you look at it on both sides, I mean, you can't underrate this Bengals defense, the offense as well for the Bengals, as we know, dominant with Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. And the same thing can be said about Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford. So it's going to be real exciting. And probably, in my opinion, I know I feel like I say this every year, but this very well could be one of the greatest Super Bowls of all time. And not just because the halftime show is going to be good as well, which I'll say this has the expectation being the greatest, but LA is in for a good one. And even though the Rams are the home team, it's going to be a good one. But going into the expectation, I'm going to say this for NASCAR on Saturday. I really do think that the expectation is this is going to be such a good race at the LA Coliseum that ultimately this is going to set the tone and set the path for future races and, other cities. Rather, let's say, they do a race in MetLife Stadium or they do things in a city and so on, maybe a street race, just like how they did Nashville for IndyCar, in Tennessee. I really think that this is going to set the tone. There's a lot of excitement, obviously, Super Bowl as well, that's going to be going on next week. But the big thing here for NASCAR is there's going to be a lot of eyes on the sport. Might I add too, very good job on their part tying themselves, with all these big LA people, and getting eyes on the sport in a positive way. Of course, Floyd Mayweather as well announcing that he's going to get his team into the Daytona 500. So with that being said, there's already a lot of eyeballs on NASCAR, but I really think this race is going to be good. Sure, if it's a crash fest, whatever, that's what happens when you have short track racing in general, very tight areas. Think about like this Bowman Gray Stadium and so on. But needless to say, this is going to be a really exciting race. And I expect this to set the tone of what NASCAR does in the future. And I really think ultimately NASCAR is going to make the schedule too a lot bigger in the future as a result of events like this. Am I surprised? I don't want to get too political or jump into it, but the Brian Flores situation, not from Brian Flores' end, but specifically the NFL end, I have to say an utter surprise. I am really bothered by the fact that the NFL turned around with zero investigation, might I add, and said that there was zero problem. Their teams did 100%, to what they were supposed to do, and that it doesn't exist. But then on the other note, say, yes, there is a race barrier and there is a problem in our league. And how do I put it? They acknowledge that there's been problems and it exists, but then they turn around on zero investigation and contradict themselves and say that, oh, but here in this instance, there's no problem. But that doesn't cancel out the whole other thing. And I will say this, not that I'm taking a side to Brian Flores, but I do have to agree. Rather, you want to break down the case, read through the whole thing and so on. I encourage people to do it. For example, I will say my one opinion in regards, for example, the New York Giants situation. I feel that side of the case may potentially, let's say, get dropped because to me, it was more of a claim towards the Rooney Rule and towards the NFL in general. But the fact that the Rooney Rule exists, to me, is a little bit problematic. I get it was meant for a good cause, but the NFL really needs to look into its analysis and really understand what's at stake here. Because, yeah, I understand Brian Flores and give him a lot of credit. He's risking the chance of never coaching in the NFL again and so on, and potentially facing the same, fate as Colin Kaepernick. But for the NFL to jump out and make the moves that they've done, just like, for example, what they did earlier in the season, with the whole Raiders situation and so on, and how they handled themselves, it shows that the NFL is practically emotional in response. And to me, it's surprising that they haven't learned from their past. And I would not be surprised if this turns into a massive, massive suit that results in Brian Flores getting paid a lot of money.
Yeah, this is going to get interesting. We're going to start with Brian Flores. We're going to be a little all over the place today, but I just want to chime in quickly with NASCAR. We'll get to NASCAR at the very end, but I just had a point come to my mind. Like the fact that this race also is at a short track and like you said, the Bowman Gray style, almost like NASCAR grassroots. I think this is perfect for them because we've seen NASCAR be very experimental over these last few years, adding in new tracks, the Bristol dirt race, adding in new road courses. And this is the first time I feel like it really feels organic more so than gimmicky, even though this is a race that doesn't count for points. The fact that they're going to a short track, they're going to an area that, by the way, has hosted stock car racing before in the parking lot of the LA Coliseum back in the 90s. I don't remember which series. I think it was K&N, but this is not the first time they've gone to this market. We know Auto Club always draws, and their short track is not coming just yet. I think this is a perfect opportunity for NASCAR, and the timing is great. The same day as the Pro Bowl, the week before the Super Bowl. Like you said, a lot of eyeballs are going to be focused on NASCAR, getting some star power involved as well. Is a great opportunity for the sport. And I think it's a good move to go to a short track. We know how much fans like short track racing. We know how good the short track racing has been, especially in the Cup Series over the last couple of years. I think this is a great move by NASCAR, and doing it on a short track, it just feels like it'll be more organic. It'll be the racing product that people want rather than just doing something crazy simply for entertainment. I don't think this is too crazy. I think a short track, I know it's really small, but I think it's going to be really fun. But we'll get to NASCAR at the very end. But we got to talk about this in the NFL, this bombshell over the past week stemming from Brian Flores. And first of all, the funny thing with all this is that this all started because Bill Belichick texted the wrong Brian on his contact list. He meant to congratulate Dable on getting the job with the Giants, and he texted Flores instead. But of course, what this set off was that the job had been decided for Dable before Brian Flores got his interview. And this is why the Rooney Rule, while a good idea, doesn't necessarily work in practice. And I think we've seen this a lot before, where things that have been done to try to create equality don't actually work in practice. And I think, you could compare this even, we're coming up on almost 2 years ago from when the Black Lives Matter movement hit its height, and George Floyd, and a lot of people wanted to defund the police or abolish the police. And I think those were some good ideas at heart, because people realized that there was a pattern of African Americans being treated and misrepresented and mistreated by police officers. But defunding the police, abolishing the police, opens up really the air ducts for so many other problems to occur. And I think we see a similar trend here. The Rooney Rule was a smart idea to try to force ownership. And a lot of the ownership, let's just be honest, in the NFL, especially back when the Rooney Rule was employed 30 years ago, a lot of old people, a lot of white people, a lot of rich people, and all three of those characteristics often spur a little bit of racism as well. It's not as extreme now, but there are still some of those people in power in the NFL. And unfortunately, that's not going to change while the old guard is still here. That being said, I think there are other things that need to be done aside from the Rooney Rule. There has to be more, and it's just hard to think of a practical way to solve this problem, but things need to be done to ensure that African Americans are given more leadership opportunities in the NFL. I was talking about this on my radio show at Rutgers. In baseball, in hockey, you kind of expect there not to be that many Black people in high positions of power because there are not that many African Americans in the leagues in general. But I think a lot of this has to go to proportionality. The NFL, 70% of their player personnel is African American, and there's only one Black coach. There are fewer Black coaches now than there were when the Rooney Rule was instituted. That right there shows that the Rooney Rule has not worked. Things need to be done. The Giants situation is unfortunate. And, as an Eagles fan, I'd love to rip on the Giants organization. But guess what? They had settled on Brian Daboll, and I don't think it really has anything to do with whether he was white, whether he was Black. It was that they thought Brian Daboll was going to be a great fit for Daniel Jones because he had turned Josh Allen into one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. That had nothing to do with race. But we see this trend every year where we see African-American coaches getting passed over. Byron Leftwich, everybody was reporting that he was going to get the Jags job last week. All of a sudden, he falls out of favor. He steps out of the running for it, and Doug Peterson becomes the coach of the Jags. I love Doug Peterson, but what happened there? David Culley gets a 4 to 5 year contract with the Houston Texans, manages to have a decent second half of the season with Davis Mills as his quarterback, and they sour on him after 1 year. Jim Caldwell takes the Lions, the most dysfunctional organization in the NFL, to the playoffs twice in 3 years, and he gets canned. And he hasn't gotten any opportunity since. He gets interviews every year. Eric Bieniemy gets interviews every year, yet they don't get hired. And that's a problem in the NFL. And the thing that's so hard is because we don't know exactly what to do to solve it, because clearly instituting a rule to force teams to interview these coaches makes it awkward, because some teams have their guys set from the beginning when they start the interviews, and being forced to interview someone there, it's just bound to happen that someone's not going to get a fair interview. And that's what we saw with Brian Flores with the Giants. And that's what we allegedly saw with Brian Flores in Denver in 2019, when they had all but settled on Vic Fangio. So that's the problem here. I don't really know how we solve it. Maybe you could add a little bit to that and maybe see how we could treat this situation. But seriously, there are problems that need to be fixed. And I think Brian Flores has a clear case. And I've even gotten to the thing about throwing games, which is a whole other issue with the NFL that we'll get to after this. But let's just start with the racial aspect first.
Well, I guess I'll start it with this, is that when you look at it, well, let's ignore the African-American aspect. Obviously, yes, 70% of your personnel and so on are African-Americans within the NFL. But what about NFL's brand new involvement with, people from other countries? For example, every year they designate a spot on the practice squad for players coming from Mexico or from the UK and so on, Australia. They come play in the NFL because they're trying to create foreign involvement. I'm not saying that by no means does this justify the NFL not having racist acts and so on, but why is it not symbolized for those people as well, that they're trying to get involved? And what I mean overall is this: yes, the Rooney Rule specifies that for each open position, head coach, GM, upper personnel, and so on, they must, for each of those positions, interview one African American. And I'll use the New York Giants as an example. They interviewed 3 for their head coaching job, 4 for their general manager position. Of course, obviously, the Giants ended up hiring Brian Daboll, and ultimately, when you look at it, you look at the timing too. For Brian Flores, he was the last one to interview. In that time, the Giants interviewed, Patrick Graham, who, let's be honest, that interview was probably not about a head coaching position more than it was. It was, if we're hiring Daboll, are you going to stay as our defensive coordinator? And who was the other one? Was it Leslie Graham? Who was it from the Bills? It was the other. It was the Bills defensive coordinator.
Leslie Frazier.
Leslie Frazier, thank you. I don't know why I said Graham. Leslie Frazier had 2 interviews, and he was one of the first people, might I add as well, to interview along with Brian Daboll on that same exact day. So the fact of the matter is this, is that we saw these candidates get interviewed and so on. Thus, the Giants really had a conclusion. The other thing too, we can't forget, there was about a 4 or 5 day gap between the interview before Patrick Graham, of course, but between the Giants' last interview and ultimately where there would have been an interview with Brian Flores. And the Giants at that point, they had their decision made. They knew they had one big interview left outside of Patrick Graham. It's, well, if he wows us, maybe we change our mind. But I think we're dead set with this decision. And thus, I know that Bill Belichick sent out a text and so on, and there's that aspect of it. But I do believe in that regard, it's not an aspect of racism. But my point is that when you look at who got interviewed and so on, I think that to avoid problems like this and avoid saying that it's forced segregation on African-American situations, within the situation, why do you not generalize the rule for all people that are generally not white individuals within the NFL? Because to me, it would make more sense if you're trying to get more foreign or minority individuals involved. To me, it would make a lot more sense. Does that mean that they still don't get hired? That doesn't solve that problem. And that I generally, just like you, cannot answer right now. The NFL is going to need to do a lot more to involve that. I know in WFAN, they suggested things like, maybe if you hire a minority individual, for a GM position or for a head coaching job, you get, a slightly % more of cap space and so on. And I don't really know if you dig into things like that, because to me, that then creates the question of unfair advantage. But the point is that the NFL has to come up with some innovative way, to solve this problem. Because I'll do a quick comparison to the MLB, and I really want to think about this now. I don't have the numbers, but think about it. On the MLB side, obviously, there's a lot of Hispanic involvement, through many foreign countries. Rather, if it's the Dominican Republic, even people from Cuba and so on, coming in and playing Major League Baseball. At the end of the day, how many people, for example, are in higher up positions in Major League Baseball that aren't white? It almost tells the same story, in my opinion, if you really do think about it. Now, of course, there's more than the NFL. I do not want to disacknowledge that. A lot more in MLB than there is in the NFL. But the point is that it's not just an NFL problem. I think that teams overall, it's just more apparent in the NFL. But the point is that there needs to be more involvement for foreign entities being involved. And I'm not saying the MLB system is perfect, because it's not perfect, but you would like to think there's a lot more, and I'm sure stats will prove there's a lot more involvement, of minority individuals in the MLB, and they have a very similar thing in terms of majority minority players. So maybe the NFL can follow, protocol or procedure, maybe that the MLB utilizes, and so on. Now, again, not things are exact, but it's a tough question to ask, and it's not going to be an overnight answer for the NFL. But at the end of the day, it's either you need to change power, you need to have new, fresh minds involved within, running the league. Otherwise, there isn't really much you can do. It's going to stay the classic NFL way, and you're going to see a bunch of ideas come back to bite them right back in the tail.
Now, I do want to say this because, I mean, every sport is going to run into this thing. Any sort of economic powerhouse, there's always going to be accusations of any sort of racial bias. But I think it's just so egregious in the NFL compared to what you'd see. You mentioned baseball, but you see far more Hispanic managers. You see far more Hispanic people in positions of power. African Americans, Asian Americans, even women getting involved, not as much with the NFL. I'll also mention the NBA. The NBA has plenty of problems, but I'll give Adam Silver props in the way that the NBA has been able to diversify and become more and more of a global game. We've seen the NBA Africa League start. So many of the coaches, the NBA for the longest time, it was white coaches and black players. And if you looked at the NBA of the 80s, the 90s, but now we've started to see a trend where you are seeing so many more African-American coaches. They're getting opportunities and they're having success. Ty Lue, Monty Williams, and it's not just African-American either. For example, what is the other NBA foreign base? It's European basketball because of the European professional basketball leagues. He didn't really work out with LeBron James, but David Blatt was brought over from Israel, got the opportunity, coached in the NBA Finals. Vlade Divac played in the NBA for many years. After that, ended up getting an executive position with the Sacramento Kings. The NBA does a much better job of incorporating everybody and having a representative personnel of higher-ups that reflects the personnel and the racial divide and the diversity that is seen in the player personnel as well. And that's the problem I see with the NFL. And the thing that I think really holds the NFL back, which is unfortunate, is that the NFL, a lot of times in terms of getting foreign involvement, it seems sometimes as too American. Even with the name football, any other country, football is attributed to soccer, but football is American football here in America. You can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but I can't think of another country where there is a sport that is so centralized with a national holiday like football and the NFL is with Thanksgiving. The NFL has become so integrated with American culture, which is great for here. That's why the NFL dominates ratings of any other sport in this country. But when you look at elsewhere and you look abroad, when the NFL goes to London, when the NFL goes to Mexico, it's not getting that much appeal. It just isn't. And that's why the teams that end up getting shipped to London for the London games are the Jaguars, are the Jets, the Dolphins, the Falcons. It's not great teams going over to play in England. And I think the NFL has to reassess how they go about incorporating things to make this more of a diverse and more of a global game. I think they have to follow some steps that Adam Silver has used in the NBA. And most importantly, while the Rooney Rule is flawed, I think there need to be other steps taken. And I think teams need to not be afraid to hire an African-American coach, because I don't want to name names, but I think there are certain teams that still in their area, in their market, they want to have a white coach. I don't think there's that many of those, but I think there are some owners, there are some markets that are still feel that way. And you can see in their coaching staffs now. But I think the NFL has the opportunity to make progress. Maybe this Flores decision, Brian Flores will get what he deserves. And also maybe we'll see a turning of the tide and some teams be more willing to hire African-American coaches. But I think it all starts up top too, with ownership, with GMs. The NBA has a very diverse ownership now. Joe Tsai getting involved, for example, with the Brooklyn Nets, and you know how China has gotten very involved with the NBA, and Asians in general ever since the insurgence of Yao Ming into the NBA in the mid 2000s. And I think the NBA has done a much better job than the NFL on that front. The NFL still has an opportunity, but they certainly need to right this wrong. And it's all going to be settled in court, but if what Brian Flores is saying is true, I think things need to be changed. But I think we have to focus even more on the other aspect of this for the competitive balance of the NFL. The other accusation that Brian Flores has made is that allegedly Dolphins owner Stephen Ross in 2019 was offering him a $100,000 per loss and was encouraging him to take a vacation during the week rather than come to practice. And that is a massive accusation. Then Hugh Jackson, who is one of the most memed coaches of all time for his 336-1 record in 2.5 seasons with the Browns, comes out of nowhere on Twitter and is suggesting that Browns ownership was offering him money for them to lose. Now, I don't know about how accurate that is, but Brian Flores is very committed to this argument about Ross. And from seeing his interviews, it seems he is even more committed, and he has some direct quotes as well. He said, even more so than the accusations against the Giants and the Broncos for their hiring practices. And if this is the case, this is a terrible look for the NFL. And if Stephen Ross was actually offering $100,000 per loss, he should not be allowed to own the Miami Dolphins. He should have that team stripped from him, and that should be redistributed to other ownership. So I wonder how much this problem actually exists. And I think the only way to solve it is with a draft lottery. I mean, you can't, teams tanking is frustrating. And there's no way you're going to prevent it without a draft lottery, because there's always one or two guys in a draft. Not as much this draft, but last year, Joe Burrow, previous years, Baker Mayfield coming out of college, Kyler Murray. There are people that you know are going to be the number 1 overall pick. Last year with Trevor Lawrence. I mean, you just know that there's going to be guys that are going to be going number 1, and then teams that are in desperate need for a quarterback are not really going to try. I'm all familiar with this, and I know you are too. When the Eagles wanted better draft positioning, the angriest I've ever seen you on the show in 2 years was when Doug Peterson decided to evaluate Nate Sudfeld in week 17 in a 6-point game on Sunday Night Football in the last game of the season and bench Jalen Hurts, allowing Washington to win and the Giants to miss the playoffs. So I think the NFL really needs to institute a draft lottery, not make it certain that a team that wins 0 games automatically gets the number 1 pick. I think it would make some games better, because the NFL is so compelling every week, but there's always those games where you see the teams that are tanking playing against good teams. They play them tough in the first half, and then all of a sudden they're terrible. And you see them back off after halftime, and it's very visible. So I think things need to be done on that front. But absolutely, if this is true that Stephen Ross gave Brian Flores money to lose, he should not be allowed to own a team in an NFL ever again.
I 100% agree. It's a problem in this league, in regards to tanking. Obviously, I mean, it's really a problem in any league. And the NBA, give them credit, did a very good job in answering to a problem by creating a draft lottery. And I feel the NFL does need to follow that same standard. When you look at it, the Lions this year, I mean, let's be honest, that team was terrible. There's no denying that. But at the same time, there's games too where the Lions this year, they look great, and then they fell apart in the second half. The Jets, I think about last year, not this year in particular, but the season before, where they went through all the controversy of, oh, we're going to call a cover zero in a big game, late in a game and let the Raiders ultimately win in the late going and so on. And it just becomes very apparent. And to me, with that being said, you have to remember this. Brian Flores is the only coach in Dolphins history in the last 20 years to have 2 winning seasons. And the fact of the matter is, he took a team with nothing to success, especially this year when we started the right team entirely out. They turned around and they found success. And it just does not surprise me if they turned around and said, hey, Brian, I'll pay you $100 or $100,000 for every single loss. Now, the big thing to me is, A, did he ever get paid? Because here's the big thing. If he has those payments in his bank account statements, and I know they were trying to ask NWFA and they couldn't disclose that, that's huge. That is huge proof. Because you think about it like this, when was it offered? Was it asked in the middle of the season? Was it asked before the season when he was hired? Because if that's the case, well, they did lose a lot of games his first year, especially. You would have evident proof. Obviously, $100,000 for loss. That's a lot of money he would have made in his first season, right? So you think about it like that. They can prove that in bank statements and so on. And if they do prove that, ultimately, I agree. The Jacksonville Jaguars should be, Jacksonville Jaguars. What am I saying? The Miami Dolphins. Listen,
We're used to the
both
Jags
play,
being the dysfunctional
yeah.
team.
Well, the Jags are still under dysfunction. I mean, you talk about being irritated. You just hired the coach that gave up on his own football team and got fired in the middle of this year, and you find that's the best option. The Jaguars are in for dysfunction yet again, needless to say. But for the Miami Dolphins, I mean, it's just plain simple. If it's proven, gotta sell the team. I mean, to me, it's bothersome that this can happen in the National Football League. It's not surprising to me, but it is definitely bothersome. I mean, we see it in the MLB too. The Houston Astros tanking for so long to finally come to relevancy. Obviously, the Cubs and so on, but it's still much different in shorter seasons in impactful bursts. And I mean, the way I look at it too for the Dolphins, you got Jalen Waddle who broke a rookie record, so on. You still don't know what's going to happen with Tua, but this team during that period when that was supposedly said to Brian Flores needed change. This team was falling apart. They were trading for picks, so on. They were trading away their best players. That team was in disarray. And the fact that Brian Flores still kept them somewhat competitive is definitely something that is tested how good of a coach he is. So it's still sticky in Miami, but that cannot happen. And I agree 100%. The NFL needs a draft lottery if this turns out to be true.
Well, obviously there's going to be more that comes of this probably in the offseason, so we'll leave it there. But let's talk about the teams that were actually trying to win this past weekend. And we'll start with the AFC Championship game between the Bengals and the Chiefs. And I just want to say, I am very happy that we got to see the overtime rule then screw over the Kansas City Chiefs. They did get the coin toss. They won the coin toss, but guess what? You can still lose even if that happens. And the Bengals defense clutched up and did what the Bills defense could not. And that was to get a stop and get the takeaway. And Joe Burrow led the way. Now, there are some people who are freaking out that Patrick Mahomes is a fraud and he's a bust. Calm down. He made the AFC Championship game 4 years in a row in his first 4 full seasons as an NFL starting quarterback. He's doing basically what Tom Brady was doing, just one less Super Bowl victory in his first 4 years. I mean, calm down for a minute. He still made it to the AFC Championship game. He was still lights out until that second half. Yeah, he had a bad half. We know the Chiefs are going to be back next year. We know Andy Reid will be there. Mahomes, Hill, Kelsey, they'll be favorites in the AFC again. So I don't want to hear anything else about Patrick Mahomes sucking. Trust me, I know a lot of people, and I'm not that upset either that Jackson Mahomes isn't going to be dancing at SoFi Stadium. But you can't be using that as fire to say that Patrick Mahomes is a bust quarterback because he's made the AFC Championship game 4 years in a row. But Joe Burrow is that guy. No offensive line, iffy defense, iffy run game, doesn't matter. He gets the win and he comes back from down 18 in the second half to take down the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, what more can you say about Joe Burrow? The fact that he was injured last year, we all thought he was going to get murdered because he had no offensive line. He still got sacked 9 times against the Titans. He still got repeatedly pressured in this game by Chris Jones, and he was still able to get the win. So big credit to the Bengals, Coach Zach Taylor, Jamar Chase, Higgins, Boyd, Uzoma. He's got quite the receiving core to work with. And for the Bengals, we all just thought eventually they were going to lose. And this is a team that at one point this year, I think they were 6-5 and they lost to Mike White and the Jets, but it doesn't matter. The Bengals are going to the Super Bowl. So quickly, I know we've talked about this game a little bit, but just your overall impressions here. We've talked more about the Bengals, but from the Chiefs' perspective, what are we looking at going forwards for Kansas City entering the offseason?
Another AFC Championship appearance. I mean, I'm just going to be completely honest. The Chiefs aren't going anywhere anytime soon. With all the contracts and money they have invested, this team is still going to be good. I honestly still expect them next season to win the AFC West. And moving forward, I mean, the real big thing for this Kansas City Chiefs team is they need to better this defense some way, somehow through draft. They have all the offensive pieces in the world. I know Travis Kelce's getting older. I know Tyreek Hill as well is getting older, with that receiving core. Maybe they need a tiny bit of receiving help, obviously, outside of Tyreek Hill. There wasn't much of a step up from Mecole Hardman, who still continues, in my opinion, to be a disappointment since that one breakout season. But, this team overall is going to need a lot of defensive help because it doesn't matter who they've brought in. They've just been consistently inconsistent. They've had great games where, they seem like they're a top 5 team defensively in the NFL. I know Chris Jones, you mentioned, for example, had a very underwhelming year, but at the end of the day, that secondary can play real strong for one half and then turn around and allow 30 points in the second half. And Steve Spagnuolo, very good defensive coordinator, but I personally still feel, for the record, that he's not been granted the pieces that he needs because of just how much money they have to pay the players on offense. And I would like to see them at least draft some more young, useful secondary players that could really help them moving forward. And I do just want to make one statement about the Bengals too. I mentioned obviously in our SEC, how good Joe Burrow has been, how ice in the veins he's been. But hasn't this felt like a progression now to this point? You think about every playoff game, it's almost like he's gone through one defensive lineman to the next level, every single game. Well, now in the Super Bowl, he's going to have the ultimate battle. It's going to be him versus Aaron Donald. It's real easy to double team Chris Jones and try to slow him down a little bit. It's another thing to try to slow down Aaron Donald. It's another thing to slow down Von Miller as well, who's played great for the Rams, since coming over. This offensive line obviously has a test, and I don't think, for the record, they're going to face the same fate as what the Kansas City Chiefs offensive line did last year in the Super Bowl. But if Joe Burrow can last these first 2, I truthfully do believe that he can find a way, with all the pressure he's going to face, to have a San Francisco-like game when Eli Manning, got dragged down to the turf 9-10 times. I was talking about this with Raheel last week. Joe Burrow getting sacked 9 times and so on reminded me of that. I truthfully believe he could stick in the pocket, do that again, make big throws for the Cincinnati Bengals, and maybe, just maybe, on the road, because let's be honest, it's not a neutral game, on the road, win against the Los Angeles Rams to win the Super Bowl.
And the toughest thing here, too, is the offensive line. Of course, the first concentration goes towards Aaron Donald. But when you're double teaming him, it gives Von Miller such an opportunity to rush the edge. And the Buccaneers did not have a terrible offensive line by any standards. And Von Miller was able to pressure Tom Brady repeatedly, had the strip sack from behind at one point late in that game. And that was really clutch to force a turnover. Then, of course, the Rams had the botched snap and turned it over in the very next play. But this is going to be a big challenge for the Bengals, but we'll set the Super Bowl stage more next week. Let's talk about the Rams defeating the Niners. NFC West matchup, Sean McVay finally gets the better of Kyle Shanahan. Of course, Kyle Shanahan had a double-digit lead in the second half of a playoff game, and we know what happens when that happens with him. They lose, and the Niners season ends. Still a good year. You go into Dallas, you go into Lambeau, get back-to-back victories, but it did slip away. And I think eventually having Jimmy Garoppolo as their quarterback caught up to them. I think Jimmy G is a decent quarterback. I don't think he's great by any standards, but I think he's decent, and I think he's going to find a good spot as a starting quarterback with some team next year. Don't know where that's going to be. Could that be Pittsburgh? Could that be Philly? I think those could be a couple places, couple directions, maybe Indianapolis, some teams that we could look at going forwards. But Trey Lance is their future with the Niners. The Niners defense is great, but it's not really a surprise that the Rams got the victory. But how do you feel about San Francisco? They exceeded expectations in the postseason. Didn't even know that if they were going to make the playoffs entering week 18, but where San Francisco goes from here with a quarterback that almost certainly is going to be dealt in the Trey Lance era coming in 2022.
Yeah, and I do have to say this, all the criticism I've given to Jimmy Garoppolo over the last 2 weeks, we actually can't say that he did make some really good throws in that game. So I will give him credit within that NFC Championship game. But yet again, the story continues. When the pressure is put on Jimmy G to make consistent big throws, the 49ers lose. It's that simple. And it's unfortunate to say because, yes, with Jimmy G, whether you like it or not, the team has won. They have been successful. But it's never good enough offensively for them to dominate. It's never good enough for them to pull away and show the potential that this team has. It feels like you're just kind of at a stall and a balance. And, you know, I agree with you. I think the 49ers, again, their defense is going to be really good. I still don't know if they're the best team in NFC West, though. Not because the Rams are going to the Super Bowl, but I just still feel that this team is the same thing that we've seen from 2-3 years ago every single year. Of course, players have gotten better, have developed better, but there still needs to be change. There can't be complacency. There are depth pieces and things. You know, the big thing, too, can Kittle stay healthy? I don't really truthfully still believe that Kittle can stay healthy on that offense. And the quarterback obviously is the big thing that's going to need to change. I mean, Trey Lance deserves a chance. Is he going to be better than Jimmy G? I'm not quite bought into that, if I'm being honest. But any little bit that can be a change to get this team maybe towards the Super Bowl, I'm sure San Francisco is willing to work with. But it's still a very concerning thing for me for San Francisco, just because the team's consistent. It's good, but just like the Packers, you know, and we're also the comparison of, well, yeah, you're here, but you have no one to get you to that next step, and they need to find that next step.
So a couple of quick topics I want to jump to before we finish up this show outside the NFL. Let's start with the NBA. Trade deadline is just a couple of weeks away. We saw the first move. I talked about that at the top of the show involving Norman Powell, but I'm a Nets fan. We got to talk about Brooklyn here. They are in free fall. They've lost 6 consecutive games. They're just a game and a half away from the play-in tournament now, which with Kevin Durant, when he's healthy, I still am not too concerned, but they have a major decision to make. James Harden clearly does not enjoy his time in Brooklyn as much as he had hoped for when he got out of Houston. It's a better situation than what he had with the Rockets, but there are still issues certainly that he has to get fixed. And we've heard him complaining, I don't like living in Brooklyn. It's not even that much about the team, and making a lot of excuses in the post-game press conferences about their recent struggles. And there's one thing if they're going to take a step back when Kevin Durant is hurt, that can be expected. But when you're getting outplayed in the second half by the Sacramento Kings, when you have basically everybody else, it's a road game, so Kyrie's playing, James Harden's there, Cam Thomas is there, everybody else is healthy, Claxton's there. You got to be able to pull out some of these games, and they are just getting completely swamped by the Western Conference, getting outplayed game in and game out, and now they've dropped 6 consecutive games and fallen from 2nd to 6th in the Eastern Conference. So the Nets really have to think about something here. James Harden, he is not going to re-sign with this team next year. It's pretty obvious. He said from the beginning he didn't want to sign an extension because he wanted to test free agency. I still think he's going to end up in Philadelphia some way or another. Now, here's the decision. The Nets said they weren't going to be taking calls on James Harden. But if you get an offer that you can't refuse, why wouldn't you take it? Even a decent offer, because he's not coming back next year. It would be better to get something for him at least than lose him and get nothing in free agency. And it pains me because this Nets team, I'd argue, would be playing better right now had they not made that James Harden trade at the beginning of last season. Because Karis LeVert's having a good year with the Pacers. Jared Allen is an absolute monster. And potentially, if that was the case, they could have afforded to keep Spencer Dinwiddie, and then they would have had a stable starting point guard for the home games when Kyrie Irving doesn't play. And then you complement that with the free agent signings from this year, who have been pretty good. Patty Mills has been an excellent addition to this team. DeAndre Bembry has fit well. James Johnson. All of these guys have been nice signings. But if you complemented them along with Kyrie and KD, if you still had LeVert, you still had Allen, they'd be so much more productive, I think, than having James Harden. I was a big backer of the James Harden trade from the beginning, but I've kind of went back on it. And now I think it's important to consider some offers and see if you can at least get something for him at this point, because I still think this team can contend for a title with Kevin Durant out there. Kevin Durant is just so unstoppable. We saw how he put this team on his back in game 6 and game 7 against Milwaukee last season. And if his shoe was half an inch smaller, they would have been moving on and probably would have played in the NBA finals and very likely would have won a championship, because the Nets and Bucks at that point last season, I think, were the two strongest teams. And I don't think you could argue any other way at that point. I just think that you can't just neglect looking for offers. I'm not saying you necessarily trade him, but you at least have to keep the option open, because there are some very stupid GMs out there who are going to be willing to give up a lot so that they can get some star power in the name of James Harden. And I'd still be curious to see what the Sixers can tie in along with Ben Simmons. A straight up Simmons for Harden deal is not happening, but if they could throw something else in, if they could throw in a Tobias Harris, if they could throw in a Tyrese Maxey, suddenly that gets a little more tempting. And I think the Nets can't just completely neglect considering a trade. I think at least has to be on their mind.
Yeah, I have to agree. The Nets have to at least consider trading James Harden, because, again, you think about how much the Nets invested into trading for him. You think about all those crazy, trades they've made in the past, where they sat years without, a first-round pick as a result of trading for the Boston Celtics core. Well, when I look at it right now for the Nets, it's, well, you don't know if you have James Harden for next year. But at the same time, they also have to believe in themselves that this core is going to win a championship. And that's where the conflicting interest is. But at the end of the day, results really tell the story. And, it stinks that this team has, for example, have not had a full participation out of Kyrie Irving, and for the record, too, the future for Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, they still loom, because realistically, they can opt out at any time from this point on, if I'm not mistaken. You could correct me, but I think their contract says so, that at the end of any year from I think it was at the point of the end of last year, they have opt-outs at the end of every season.
I think Kyrie does. I think Durant re-upped that his doesn't opt out for a couple of years.
Okay, because I was going to say, because I'm pretty sure they still have opt-out options, which is why, again, well, if they don't like that James Harden goes, they can opt out at the end of the year anytime if they don't win a title this year. So it's like, realistically for the Nets, it's do or die. They feel like this needs to be their last chance at the title, but I go back to this point. On paper, the Nets should be the best team in the NBA. Should be. But there's no depth outside of the starting five. You've traded away. You've let everyone go that were your big depth pieces to make this team something without Kevin Durant, without Kyrie Irving, without James Harden. And again, Steve Nash still going through what we have to remember is a first full year. He's still going to go through ups and downs, as a coach. But when it's all said and done, I mean, it doesn't matter who you bring in a coach. It doesn't matter, what they sign. It's the fact that this team doesn't have the money to have depth, because they have so much money invested into 3 players. I mean, this team is negative in the cap by a good bunch of millions to this point. So it's not like they can turn around, even get themselves a Dennis Schroeder, let's say, to back up. They can't turn around and get, a key sixth man. They can't get themselves a Jordan Clarkson like the Jazz have. They need to trade away one of their big pieces to bring back this depth. So you mentioned a potential, let's say, 76ers trade for Ben Simmons. Not only would you get a superstar in return, but you can add a little bit of depth. I'd buy into that. I'd buy into that 100% if I was Brooklyn. But when it's all said and done, I mean, we'll see what happens post All-Star break. But, I mean, this team is just, it's falling apart. I'm just going to be honest. Without the depth, this team is always hurt, always inconsistent. And yes, they can win games and they can do whatever. And they're going to make the playoffs, let's be honest. Even though they've fallen this far, they're still going to make the playoffs. But for this to be a team that was expected to win a championship and win now, there's no excuses this year. Outside of Kyrie Irving joining late, you've practically had everyone together. And it's disappointing that this team cannot put consistent minutes when it matters, because outside of, like I said, having a good starting five, that means come playoff time, they're going to have to play all 48 minutes if you want a chance at winning. And that's just unrealistic, because there's not a single big player on a consistent basis that you can pick on that Brooklyn bench to say, wow, they're going to make productive shots when we need you to and really help out our starters.
Yeah, and we saw what happened last year when Kevin Durant and James Harden had to play all 48 minutes. The reason they lost was because Kevin Durant was so exasperated after 52 minutes in an overtime game that he left that potential game winner short. And that's how everything ended. But it's just frustrating because you'd think this team would plan ahead, because let's be honest, Kevin Durant is coming off of a major injury late in his career. And he's 15 years into his career. No matter how athletic somebody is, they're going to start breaking down. They're going to get the occasional injury. Kevin Durant's injury this time around was very fluky, with Bruce Brown getting knocked over into his knee. But still, you got to be prepared for that. You also have to be prepared. Let's be honest. We know Kyrie Irving can be a bit of a head case sometimes. And let's go even before COVID, when he wouldn't play last season at times and disappeared, and then all of a sudden he's found on some Zoom for some council meeting in Brooklyn, or he's out at his sister's birthday party and he's claiming that he's injured, or he's spending mental health time. That's not a knock at either of them. They're both amazing basketball players. You need to have people that can fill that gap. And James Harden, who was in the midst of a decline and showed up to Rockets training camp ridiculously overweight and out of shape, is not the answer to that. Who would have been the answer? It's Karis LeVert, is Jarrett Allen, Spencer Dinwiddie, the players who had been there for a few years, had made a run to the playoffs and challenged the Philadelphia 76ers before the superstars even came around, and were established members of this Brooklyn Nets team. But no, they let one of them walk and they trade the other ones away. They would be great pieces to have right now rather than James Harden. And I know Joe Harris is hurt and he's been out, and that's a tough thing to deal with. But James Harden and Kyrie Irving need to pick up the slack here. We knew this team, this 4 to 6 week stretch, was going to be tough without Kevin Durant on the floor due to his MCL sprain, but I don't really envision it getting this bad. So the Nets really have to exhaust all options, because this has gotten really bad. But speaking of things that are really bad, Major League Baseball has now been in a lockout for 2 months, and they attempted to bring in a federal mediator, and the Players Association, just like in 1994, said no. So we're now 10 days away from when pitchers and catchers were supposed to report to spring training. Obviously, that's not happening at this point. So I asked Zoe this a couple of weeks ago. I want to get your take. At this point, with the way things are going, what do you see as the most realistic solution of when we're going to get regular season baseball this year?
We're going to have replacement players. That's my simple answer. We're going to have replacement players. You're not going to get players for pitchers and catchers to report in time. And it's as simple as this. You have the wrong people in power in MLB, just like I will say with NFL, where you simply cannot find common ground. And Major League Baseball, with the system it has, it's just frustrating because honestly, you know, when baseball last had its lockout, it was a headline every day of, oh, what's baseball doing? You know, how even when the NFL had their lockout, their brief lockout, all right, what are they doing? What are they planning to make changes? This time around, especially I'll think about most recently, even though it wasn't a full lockout, but during the pandemic, right, it was, all right, what is Major League Baseball going to do with its players? And obviously made that whole thing with the salaries and so on that made players say, hold up, we don't want to play. We're gonna go against. But it was a talk every day. This isn't a discussion every day. It quite literally isn't. It's gone very quiet. We can argue this entire offseason. It does not feel like that pitchers and catchers are going to report in 10 days. It honestly feels like the offseason just started with how quiet it's been. And the other thing, too, we have to remember is this. We still have free agents, big free agents, might I add, that still haven't signed with teams as a result of this lockout. So there's still big free agents that may only sign now 1-year deals to come and play if baseball ever starts, because they're not going to be ready for when pitchers and catchers report. So I just find it to be like this. Baseball is going to be at a very, very far distance, but I just don't feel like there's any budging anytime soon. And I don't blame the Players Association. I don't blame MLB either for wanting what their team owners want. But at some point, you have to find mutual ground and a mutual understanding. And I just don't see that happening anytime soon. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the MLB seems to have allowed, all right, the Players Association gives us this demand. We're not going to respond for 4, 5, 6 days. All right, now here's our proposal for this. And it's something completely opposite. And they're just simply, like I said, no mutual ground. The MLB wants something one way. There's no agreement. There's no 50-50 balance. It's 90-10 or 100-0 basically on what they're trying to agree upon right now. And I just, like I said, I don't see anything starting anytime soon. I think the regular season is going to get cut to 120 games. And I honestly don't see baseball starting until summertime, because I really think that once this season reaches the point of where it's supposed to start, and the fact that they're not going to have players ready because they didn't have camp and so on, unless they bring replacement players right away, which, let's be honest, that's probably not going to happen. They have to go through a whole, process like they did with COVID of giving players a month, rather if it's independent camps and so on, to get ready, ready for the season. So I think we're going to see a 120 game season, and I quite frankly think that we're going to probably see the playoff system as well that we saw for the pandemic, and hopefully it works out for Major League Baseball. But right now, like I said, it's embarrassing. It really is embarrassing, because I truthfully think baseball is going to have the least amount of eyes from a fan perspective. After can we not discredit this, by the way? Such a good year last year for what Major League Baseball did with all these games, doing the Field of Dreams and so on, and bringing eyes back to baseball. Now we're at this state. And I feel like people are going to forget about baseball and not want to watch baseball as much, compared to maybe the NBA or other sports that are going to be reaching their peak points of the season. And it's just a shame, because the MLB is more focused on something that they could easily balance and be more realistic about, and they're not going to do so.
Well, let's finish with NASCAR. And I have a little bit of fiery competitive spirit right now because I lost the 2021 NFL Pick'em. So we've each split the Pick'em. So guess what? I've formulated a little format. We're going to be doing NASCAR Pick'em through this season. So for the points races, we'll pick the stage 1 winner, the stage 2 winner, and the race winner, and I'll tally up some points that way. But for the Busch Clash, only picking race winner. So this is going to be interesting. And we know there's going to be a lot of bumping and banging. And then based on where the person finishes, we'll, allocate points, and I'll figure that all out. You can follow along on our Twitter at SportsSpeak Live. But Busch Clash in California, LA Coliseum, retrofitted as a quarter-mile NASCAR track. It's going to be fun. Heat races, LCQ, and a main event. But I was thinking about a couple of people, and I'm going to go a little out of the box, but maybe not really, because it's the team that dominated last season, and that's Hendrick Motorsports, but not the driver you might think. Kyle Larson, of course, coming off the championship. Chase Elliott, the champion the year before. but I like Alex Bowman, and I know you're a Bowman fan. I think Alex Bowman is going to win the Busch Clash. Just hear me out. You're going to need to be aggressive to win this race. You're also going to need to be at least a decent short track racer. Alex Bowman won 2 short track races last season, both of them from making aggressive moves. Last time we were at a short track in the Cup Series, Alex Bowman, who was already out of the playoff picture, was unfazed to boot someone racing for a Final Four spot out of the way to win the race. Now there's no points in the line. So imagine how little he's going to hold back here. So I'm going to go out of the box here. I think Alex Bowman in that number 48 is going to get the first win in the next gen era. And that's my official pick for week 1 of our NASCAR Pick'em. Tim, before we sign off, I want to get your pick as well.
I couldn't argue against you, obviously, because of the fact that I'm an Alex Bowman fan. I would love to see that, but I'm going to have to go with the person he punted out of the way at Martinsville, Dennis Hamlin. It's simple. I think Denny will find a way to get it done when it's all said and done. And might I say too, it would be very fitting for him to be the first next gen winner after all racing through all 3 recent generations of cars, going back to, along with, might I add, Kevin Harvick as well, who have gotten a race, through Gen 4 or 5 and so on. And I really think that, with this next gen, there's a lot of stuff that we're gonna have to answer. And by the way, I truthfully do believe that Alex Bowman will be on the front row of the Daytona 500. I know that's not going to be a projection that we're going to do towards this season, but I believe that Hendrick will continue its super speedway speed dominance during speed weeks. Maybe not results wise, but at least through qualifying. But I'm interested to see, because I think this is a real big opportunity for Gibbs. I feel like they've put a lot of time focusing on the next gen. Let's not forget that they stood practically with the same car in the Cup Series for the last 2-3 years to set up to this point. I feel like, obviously, there was a lot of optimism in practice and so on, but I will say this, I know that we only saw a lot of super speedways and 1.5 testing and so on, not as much fully the short tracks for the next gen cars in the last month and a half or so. But Toyota did a really good job during a lot of those tests, which, again, make me want to think in a race that, let's be honest, is going to be nothing about pure survival, during this clash. But I think Denny Hamlin, if you speak survival and you speak aggression, that's Denny Hamlin's forte. And I think that he has a good chance of winning this race.
All right, well, we'll see what happens. Busch Clash on Sunday, our NASCAR weekly pick'em getting started. You can follow along on our Twitter at SportsBeak Live. It's where you can also find information, trying to get this on Anchor so we can get this on other podcast sites aside from YouTube. But of course, every episode can be found on YouTube. All that information will be found on Twitter. Fun next 2 weeks coming up. Next week, we'll be doing a Super Bowl pregame show, and we'll get some people on, and we can talk and preview the Bengals-Rams matchup. And the week after that is our NASCAR season preview leading up to the Daytona 500. One of my favorite times of the year in sports, mid-February. Gonna have a lot to talk about over these next couple of weeks on SportsBeak. So we'll hope you join us then, but that's it for today. So until next time, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Signing off on SportsBeak. We hope you have a great rest of your weekend.